Hello, and welcome to Dig a Podcast, a show that tells the in-depth story behind the songs of the greatest band that is, was, and ever will be, the Beatles. In this season, Season 1, we will explore the Beatles' first LP, Introducing the Beatles, or our UK listeners would know it as Please Please Me. Introducing the Beatles was originally scheduled for a July 1963 release, but came out on the 10th of January 1964 on VJ Records, whereas Please Please Me was released on the 23rd of March 1963 on EMI's Parlophone label. So let's conclude with the last song on the album of Introducing the Beatles with
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Twist and Shout. There are a total of 25 cover songs that have been recorded and released by the Beatles during their EMI career. Each of these songs, including Maggie May, were previously included in their repertoire, which were chosen because of their love for these songs. Even though it was their desire to record their own compositions, the rigours of writing 14 songs per album, 2 albums per year, as well as 4 singles per year, became too great of a task to fill with all original compositions. This presented them the opportunity to officially record the cream of the crop cover songs that they loved as well as they knew like the back of their hands. The vast majority of these 25 songs, while all being essential ingredients to the Beatles' catalogue, were adaptations of the original versions which arguably didn't eclipse the geniusness of the original source. Although the Beatles' aim was to take the world by storm, they respectfully recorded these numbers with the intention of not straying too much from the original arrangements. Instead, they adapted that original arrangement within their limit guitar, bass, drums format and did so very admirably. The undeniable exception to the previous rule is Twist and Shout. Although the Beatles' adaptation was a direct reflection of the hit version by the Isley Brothers, the result turned out to become the definitive version of the song, peaking at number 2 for 4 weeks on the US Billboard charts. It outcharted the Isleys' rendition, peaking at number 17 by leaps and bounds. As of April 1964, Twist and Shout became, and always will be known as, a Beatles song. Songwriting history. The history of Twist and Shout begins with the impressive career of songwriting producer Bert Russell, aka Bert Burns. He can easily be called a pioneer in rock and roll as well as soul music in the 60s. Bert was born in the Bronx, New York, on November 8, 1929, to Russian Jewish immigrants. His first introduction to music was studying classical piano when quite young. He contracted rheumatic fever as a child, but developed an intense love for all kinds of music, including soul, gospel, blues, and Latin salsa music, which eventually led him to working in nightclubs in Cuba. After his return from Cuba in 1960, he returned to New York, started working as a songwriter with the Brill Building Group under the hire of Bobby Mellins. His first noteworthy composition was the collaboration with Phil Medley in the Latin-influenced song Twist and Shout, which was written to capitalize on the huge twist dance craze that began in 1960. Phil Medley's other claim to fame was the song A Million to One, recorded by Jimmy Charles and the Ravelettes with Phil Medley's orchestra, which peaked at number 5 on the Billboard charts in 1960. Twist and Shout was first recorded and released as a B-side by the Atlantic Records signed group The Top Notes in 1961. The song was produced by the newly acquired Atlantic producer Phil Spector, although Bert was very unhappy with the production of the song, saying that he messed it up. After his first success with writing the 1961 song A Little Bit of Soap with the Jamals, which peaked at number 12 on the Billboard charts, Bert turned his attention back to Twist and Shout. The group, the Isley Brothers, were then a struggling rhythm and blues act, signed by Wand Records, who were dying to have their first top 40 hit. Bert thought to give the song to the Isley Brothers to record in 1962, but this time produced the recording himself. This proved to be the initial success of the song, peaking at number 17 on the Billboard pop charts and launching the successful career of the Isley Brothers. With these accomplishments under his belt, Bert's career as a songwriter and producer continued to flourish. His songwriting achievements include Tell Him by the Exciters, Kill Joe by the Rockefellers, Hello Walls by Little Esther Phillips, I Want Candy by the Strangeloves and eventually Bow Bow Bow, Here Comes Tonight by Them featuring Van Morrison, Hang On Sloopy by the McCoys featuring Rick Derringer, and Piece of My Heart by Emma Franklin, Big Brother, and Holding Company featuring Janis Joplin, and eventually Faith Hill. In 1963, Bert took over the role as resident songwriter-producer of Atlantic Records from Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, and involved himself in every aspect of recorded product. From finding the songs, working with them in the studio, all the way to overseeing the final product. In this capacity, he worked at launching and stabilizing careers of such acts as The Drifters, Barbara Lewis, Solomon Burke, and Ben E. King. In 1965, Bert continued his momentum with starting two successful record companies, Bang Records and Shout Records. He continued his production credits by working with the Strangeloves, Van Morrison, the McCoys, Freddie Scott, Emma Franklin, and Neil Diamond, among others. Tragically, on December 30th, 1967, Bert Burns died of heart failure at only 38 years of age. This put a stop to the remarkable run of success that truly transformed the face of pop music in the 60s and influenced the music industry for decades to come. The Isley Brothers, whose version of Twist and Shout the Beatles based their version on, have a long-standing career which actually spans 6 decades. This makes them the longest-running charted group in music history, going through multiple generations of members based with the original three-brother lineup of Ronald, Rudolph, and O'Kelly Jr. The Cincinnati, Ohio-based group spanned many genres of music, including gospel, doo-wop, R&B, soul, funk, rock, adult contemporary, and even hip-hop. They paved the way for artists to open their own record label, as they used the proceeds from the success of Twist and Shout to start their own T-Neck Records in 1965, even beating out the Beatles' Apple Records by 3 years. Their first success was what was to become an R&B classic, the self-penned Shout, which was also performed by the Beatles during their early Hamburg Cavern years, as well as their first British television special, Around the Beatles. This version appears on the Beatles album Anthology 1. As the Isleys were the opening act for Jackie Wilson on a tour, Ronald Isley spontaneously and excitedly went into a gospel routine with his brothers while Jackie Wilson was performing. Ronald was yelling out, "You know you make me want to shout," which was heard by a RCA record scout that was there in the audience at the time. They were then signed to RCA Records and recorded their self-penned Shout, which peaked at number 47 on the Billboard Pop charts. The song eventually reached the top 10 in the US by Joey D and the Starlighters, and in the UK by Lulu. They continued on RCA for a couple of years, but were not able to even match the success of Shout, so they signed with Spectre One Records in 1962. Bert Burns then gave his co-written composition Twist and Shout to the Isleys as their first release on the label. The Isleys thought the song was too pop-orientated for them, but relented and followed the lead of Bert Burns and his production of the song to the group's first top 40 hit, reaching 17 on the Billboard pop charts of the summer of 1962. Unfortunately, their career continued to flounder afterwards, as all of their following releases on One Records failed to make a dent on the pop charts. Even their self-penned original version of Nobody But Me, which eventually became a number 8 hit by the Human Beings in 1968, failed to make an impact for them. They then took the money made from Twist and Shout and formed an independent label, T-Neck Records, and in 1965 started releasing singles featuring an unknown guitarist, Jimmy James, whose real name was Jimi Hendrix. They also tried a stint with Motown Records, which did return them briefly to the top 40 with their Tamla hit, This Old Heart of Mine Is Weak for You, peaking in at number 12 on the Billboard pop charts. Motown's attention was instead primarily focused on their previously established acts, such as The Temptations and The Supremes, so the Isleys re-established T-Neck Records in 1968 as a subsidiary of Buddha Records. By 1969, after recruiting younger brother Ernie and Marvin as musical members of the group, they had their biggest hit to date, the funk anthem It's Your Thing, which reached number 2 on the Billboard pop charts as well as number 1 on the Black Singles chart. Their success continued throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s, scoring 8 more top 40 singles, all on their own T-Neck record label. Hits include That Lady Part 1 peaking at number 6, Fight the Power Part 1 peaking at number 4, and the Stephen Stills classic Love the One You With, which peaked at number 18. They also acquired a total of 7 number 1 hits on the R&B charts, including a duet with R. Kelly called Down Low, Nobody Has to Know in 1996. Their 2001 hit Contagious, which hit number 19 on the Billboard pop charts, makes a total of 5 decades of top 40 hits for the Isley Brothers' career to date. The music of the Isley Brothers have been covered by numerous artists such as Rod Stewart, Michael Bolton, The Who, The Supremes, Vanessa L. Williams, and sampled by Gwen Stefani, Ice Cube, The Notorious B.I.G., and the Beastie Boys, among others. The Isley Brothers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1992, as well as the Vocal Group Hall of Fame in 2003. Original member Ronald Isley has been a member of the group throughout its charted success, from Shout in 1959 through Contagious in 2001 and to the present. The impact of the Isley Brothers has been and will be felt in the music industry for many decades to come. Recording history. George Martin has been quoted as saying that he told the Beatles on February 11th, 1963 to play me this selection of things I've chosen from what you do at the Cavern. At one point, he even said he purposely arranged for Twist and Shout to be recorded last on this day, so that Lennon's voice would create a linen-ripping sound. All things considered, with all the quotes analysed, it looks as though the choice to record this song was indeed a last-minute decision between all involved in the studio on that day. The actual circumstances appear to be that after beginning at 10 a.m. that morning, it was now 10 p.m. According to engineer Norman Smith, all of their throats were tired and sore, and that the band, plus the recording staff, filed into the EMI canteen for a small coffee and biscuit break, knowing that one more song was required. What would it be? No other original composition was deemed suitable at the time, having been deemed the attempted Hold Me Tight not good enough to go back and finish at that late hour of the day. Several songs were suggested and vetoed. No one can remember who it was that suggested Twist and Shout at this point, possibly George Martin, but despite John's voice being especially gone by the time, he reluctantly agreed to sing it. He sucked on a couple more zoobs, throat sweets, gargled some more milk, took his shirt off for some reason, and went back with the band to record the final song of the day. So the decision to do the song appears to be a true last-minute decision. Because of the poor condition of Lennon's throat, everyone knew they had to get it right first time, even in the control booth. So with that first take, the Beatles performed live exactly what you hear on the record to this day. No overdubs were needed, and that legendary performance that evening at approximately 10:15 p.m. had a marked effect on everyone present. Richard Langham, one of the engineers present on that historic day, called this take an amazing demonstration. George Martin himself astonishingly exclaimed at the time, "I don't even know how they did it. We've been recording all day, but the longer we go on, the better they get." George Martin, being the perfectionist that he is, insisted on trying one more take of the song, just in case. A second complete take was performed, not a false start, but John's voice could not hold up any longer. The Beatles then insisted on hearing the album playback to them that evening. Lennon had stated back then that since they were perfectionists, hearing the album played back was one of their most worrying experiences. He said they may have wanted to do it all again if they weren't happy with it, but they decided that they were very happy with the result. This extended the session to 10:45 p.m, at which time Brian Epstein, who had also been present for that historic day, gave engineer Richard Langham a ride home to Camden Town. The mono and stereo masters of this song were made along with the rest of the album on February 25th, 1963. The version of Twist and Shout that thereafter shook the world as was deemed complete on this day. It has remained untouched and unaltered until this day. On April 19th, 1964, the Beatles made a further audio recording of the song at IBC Studios in London in preparation for the television special Around the Beatles, which was the first broadcast on British television on May 6, 1964. The Beatles arrived at the recording studio sometime in the early evening on this day in April, recording 7 selections of 3-track tape with Terry Johnson as balance engineer and Glenn Johns as second engineer and tape operator. The recording session was over by about 8:30 p.m, all ready for the Beatles to mime for the filming of the show on April 28, 1964. Then came the Beatles' August 23, 1964 concert at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles, California. This concert was recorded with the intention of Capitol releasing a live album for the American market. Capitol Vice President Voyal Gilmore shared production credit with George Martin, and Hugh Davis has been indicated as engineering of the recording. Although this project was abandoned until 1977 release of the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl album, this version of Twist and Shout did get a partial release on the Beatles Story documentary album released in November of 1964. To give a complete recording history for this music, 2 additional takes of Twist and Shout did occur on January of 1969 during the rehearsal for what eventually became the Let It Be album and movie. The first was on January 8th at Twickenham Film Studios, and the second was on January 26th at Apple Studios. Neither of those brief attempts were included on the album or the movie, or were released officially in any form. Incidentally, Glenn Johns, who was mentioned earlier as second engineer at the IBC studio session on April 19th, 1964, was hired as producer for the Beatles project. Thanks for listening to Dig a Podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. This has been a Team Wilgo production. Until next time, if you know what I mean. Do I did? No? Okay.